Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Newseum's Night TV studio. My name is John Maynard. I'm the Senior Director of Programs here. We're so pleased to be partnering with Georgetown University's Gender+Justice initiative for a conversation on the long struggle for LGBTQ rights, as well as the current threats affecting LGBTQ people. Today's program is inspired by the Newseum exhibit, Rise Up, Stonewall, and the LGBTQ Rights Movement. I hope we've all had a chance to see that. The exhibit, of course, marks the 50th anniversary of the 1969 police raid of the Stonewall Inn. The protests following the raids are considered to be the catalyst that inspired the modern gay liberation movement. The mission of the Newseum and the Freedom Forum Institute is to increase public understanding of the importance of the First Amendment, and through our programs and exhibits, visitors learn how the core freedoms of the First Amendment apply to their lives. Over the years, activists have used their First Amendment freedoms to demand an end to discrimination against LGBTQ Americans in housing, employment, and public accommodations. We're thrilled to welcome so many students here today, and I want to thank Melissa Hafaf, the program director of the initiative, for organizing today's program. Thank you, Melissa. Our moderator today is Georgetown law professor Nan Hunter, who brings expertise to the university in the fields of constitutional law, feminist legal theory, federal court litigation, and health law. She served as associate dean from 2011 to 2016, and prior to joining Georgetown, she worked for the American Civil Liberties Union and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She's taught as a full-time or visiting professor at Brooklyn Law School, Harvard Law School, the University of Miami Law School, and UCLA Law School. Before I turn it over to Nan, who will introduce our distinguished panel, I do want to introduce Denise Brennan, Gender+Justice Initiative co-faculty director. She is also the chair of anthropology at Georgetown. Denise?
Thank you for battling, I'm not sure what, down here. No, really, thank you for being here. It's going to be a dynamite afternoon. So the Gender+Justice Initiative at Georgetown is an umbrella of faculty across 3 campuses, the medical school, the law center, and then the main campus. We do events on campuses and incubate research, but we're also public facing, like this event. John, thank you so much for hosting this. So find us on the internet, send us an email if you have an idea for an event, a collaboration. We're happy we're launching a new series of book talks in collaboration with the DC libraries. So if you have ideas, if you have something you want to announce, we would love to lift up your work. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
You're the moderator.
All right. Hi, I'm Nan Hunter. I'm a law professor at Georgetown, and I'm very happy to moderate this panel of fabulous speakers, all of whom have a connection with Georgetown Law School, I'm happy to say, most of whom are grads. We'll let Paul be here anyway, because he is one of my colleagues on the faculty at Georgetown. So what we're going to talk about today really focuses on the future more than the past. And I'm going to try and moderate a kind of a conversation, so it isn't just sort of like one presentation sort of blasting out after the next. And I'm going to start with the person to my left, Mark Joseph Stern, who is a writer at Slate, who covers the Supreme Court, and along the way covers a number of political issues, including LGBT rights issues. And Mark, since you're the journalist on the panel, you have a big picture perspective, we think, we hope. And we are now in the middle of Trump.
Hopefully the middle.
Hopefully the middle of the Trump
Approaching
era.
the end.
Yes, I hope so. So what is the big picture? I mean, the LGBT community had a very generally successful 8 years with the Obama administration. We're now in this. What should we be focused on?
So I think the big picture narrative right now is legal setbacks in the midst of cultural gains and societal gains, right? If you look around, there are so many shows on TV that feature LGBTQ characters. There are more openly LGBTQ politicians than ever. All of this is discussed in the wonderful exhibit, which I do hope you check out. It features one of Paul's binders from arguing Lawrence v. Texas before the Supreme Court, which is very neat. But of course, at the same time, you have an administration that's extraordinarily hostile to LGBTQ rights. And just because Trump does not go out and openly bash LGBTQ people the way that past Republican presidents have, does not mean that his administration isn't working overtime to try to curtail our freedoms and liberties. For instance, just yesterday, the Trump administration rolled out a rule that will allow federally funded adoption and foster care agencies to turn away perfectly qualified same-sex couples and gay people simply because of their sexual orientation. We also know that the Trump administration has banned openly transgender people from serving in the armed forces, a relatively rare instance of actually reversing a gain that was already made. You know, when that occurred, you already had thousands of openly transgender people who were serving their country honorably, and in fact could even enlist in the military and say, I am openly transgender and I want to serve, and Trump reversed that. And the Supreme Court allowed it to take effect by a 5-4 vote, the 5 conservative justices against the 4 liberals. And that is the dynamic that we're seeing right now. The Trump administration pushing as hard as it can, sometimes under the banner of religious liberty, sometimes out of what appears to be sheer animus to harm LGBTQ people, and the courts deciding just how much of it they're going to tolerate. Obviously, with Justice Anthony Kennedy gone, there's no sort of conservative champion for LGBTQ rights on the Supreme Court anymore. Justice Kavanaugh has done nothing to indicate that he shares Kennedy's tolerance or acceptance or support of gay people, let alone transgender people. And so I think, again, the big picture is, look, if you talk to young people today, they say, why would I possibly be opposed to same-sex marriage? They can't even conceptualize it. And yet you go look at what the administration is doing, and all of it is aimed at, again, curtailing the rights of LGBTQ people. And the courts that are being created today, the judges who Trump is putting on the bench, are in the mold of Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch, if not more extreme in their hostility to gender and sexual minorities. And these people will be serving for the rest of our lifetimes. Yeah. So the big picture is not all bleak, right? The big picture is not America is a hellscape for LGBTQ people. But the problem is that in a relatively short amount of time, this administration has been able to do immense damage to the kind of structure of liberties that we tried to build up under Obama and before then. And there are so many judges who are hostile to those liberties that it's going to be a fight and a slog uphill to try to regain and build upon all of the victories that we celebrated under Obama.
Yeah, kind of reminds me of politics at large, right?
Right.
A fight and a slog to try and maintain basic liberties. Well, speaking of the court, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Paul Smith, who did argue Lawrence versus Texas successfully, and who has argued a number of other cases at the court as well, involving voting rights and other issues. And so, Paul, from your perspective, we've got a new court now. We've got 2 new justices. That shifts, you know, a lot of dynamics around. We don't know how.
Yeah, we do.
Well, we don't know how exactly, maybe
Right.
on every single case.
Right.
But what is your thinking about the Supreme Court?
Well, as Mark said, the court has dramatically changed, as Nan said as well. With the loss of Justice Kennedy and his replacement by Justice Kavanaugh, you have a court where what used to be a pretty trustworthy majority of 5 for our issues is no longer there. And that doesn't mean we're going to lose everything. We may very well, at least it's possible, we could win these Title VII cases, or at least one of them that are pending. We'll talk about in a minute. But what you have is 5 justices who think Obergefell is completely wrong. And they probably think Lawrence is wrong. You know, they really don't believe that the Constitution protects us as a community. That doesn't mean they will do anything to take back the progress that has been made for marriage equality. But if you ask them, that's what they think. And so that means that it's going to be not a court where we make progress. With the potential exception of this Title VII case, constitutionally, it's going to be all the other way. Their role will be in the next decade or two cutting back on progress which we've made in other fora, primarily legislative fora. Their real focus is protecting the perceived religious liberty of conservative religious people who feel slighted by having the application of anti-discrimination laws. So the Masterpiece Cake Shop problem is the wave of the future, I think. And it's only really a question of how far they will go in imposing exemptions from statutory protections that we've been able to win.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it over to Sharita from Center for American Progress. You're a LGBT issues policy director. Mark says it's politics versus the culture in the next wave. What are your thoughts as you think about a sort of policy-oriented menu?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as you all heard, the courts are not going to save us. So we've been really focused on Congress. There is an answer. It's the Equality Act to a lot of these issues. We don't have explicit full non-discrimination protections. There's actually only 2 laws that mention sexual orientation and gender identity: the hate crimes law and the 2011 reauthorization about the Violence Against Women Act. Outside of 2 laws, we don't have any reference to sexual orientation or gender identity protections, which is absurd in 2019. So ever since 1974, we've been trying to push legislation that would explicitly include prohibitions on discrimination against LGBTQ folks. And it's popular. It's something that everybody agrees on besides party lines, no matter where in the country you are, no matter what faith you are. We have majorities of support for this. But unfortunately, we have a Senate led by Mitch McConnell right now. And so even though it passed overwhelmingly in the House last spring, it's not passing anytime soon. And we've still got a lot more pushing and a lot more culture change and really articulating and having people understand. I think there's also a majority of people who think that these protections are already in law. Beyond just our arguments that sex protects us, there's laws that we don't have. So federal funding, which doesn't include protections for sex. So we don't really have that avenue for sexual orientation and gender identity protection to ensure that taxpayer-funded services can't turn you away because you're married to someone of the same sex or because you're trans. And as Mark said, there's a proposed rule that just dropped that would take away the very little protections we have for $500 billion of taxpayer monies funding services to turn you away.
Sort of like adoption services?
That's one example,
Yeah.
but HHS is massive. So we're talking services for seniors to age in place. Senior LGBT elders face incredible rates of discrimination and bias, and we hear reports of people feeling like they have to go back into the closet. Local food pantries, Head Start programs, childcare assistance, like you name it, HHS does it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they're proposing the ability of people to refuse to serve you. And as was mentioned right now, as we have gains in protections, the backlash is this argument that somehow treating LGBTQ people with dignity and respect is an affront to people's faith beliefs. And there is a lot of pushback and calls for religious exemptions. So it's not just a fight for full equality in the law, it's also not allowing the second-class citizenship to be applied to us and saying like, no, you don't actually have a license to discriminate against protected characteristics just because of your religious beliefs.
So I want to throw it now to Sandy James, who is in charge of legal issues, I guess, at Free State, Maryland. So you're at the state policy level and litigation level, and we've been talking about the Supreme Court and the Congress. What's your view from a kind of moderately blue state, I would say? Light blue state, maybe.
Yeah, except for the governorship. Just to echo a little bit of what Sharia said, the courts aren't going to save us. A lot of the federal government's certainly not going to save us. And in fact, they are doing their very best, it would seem, to roll back protections or to affirmatively prevent us from being able to live our full lives. So I think states have to step up. States have been stepping up in this regard for quite some time. And anyone here can correct me if I'm wrong about the numbers, because I'm not always right about that. But we have 28 states right now who don't have any kind of protections, which means that we have quite a few who do, but more than half do not. And there are different levels of protection, we should say. And just because you have some legislation on the books doesn't mean you've actually implemented it well or that there's any teeth behind it. So we do have states that have long-standing protections. For example, I'll use the District of Columbia, a state into the District of Columbia, has very wide-sweeping protections, a really good human rights ordinance. It protects lots and lots of categories, but you still see similar levels of discrimination in education and healthcare and the workplace and all of these sorts of things. So you need not only a robust legislation, but you need a strong enforcement mechanism to back all of these up. But in terms of some key things that states can do, we need states to step up and start plugging these gaps where the federal government is starting to erode them. HHS, this mega agency that is charged with ensuring that we all have access to health care, has made it pretty clear that they're not interested in having LGBTQ people covered in that. So it's everyone but LGBTQ people. There are also some other categories in there, but we'll just focus on LGBTQ people for right now. So we need states to step in. So we've talked about rollbacks. Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act is something that's recently, there's been a proposed rule that would completely gut all the protections that were in there, not just for LGBTQ people, but also for English as a second language individuals, low proficiency individuals, all sorts of things. So we need states to start to step in and pass legislation that will bring back those protections. We need states to say, our citizenry is protected from healthcare discrimination, unequivocally. We need that to be happening. And states are working on that. I can't say too much about who is actually getting that done, but states are working on that. But it's time for states to do a little bit more. And whether you start to look to your neighbors, for example, in Maryland, we are able to say, hey, DC, gosh, Virginia, we're able to look to other states. In Pennsylvania, our neighbors are doing things. We don't want to be left behind. Apparently that's a compelling argument for some legislators. They don't want to be the state that's left behind because they don't want to lose out on business opportunities or what have you because they are seen as a discriminatory state. But not only do we need healthcare protections at the state level, employment protections need to be put into place. I just want to say this one thing. In the education realm, this is the backbone. We're here at a Georgetown event. Education is the backbone for so many things we do. Education has, particularly at the K through 12 level and then in higher education, has ripple effects for everything, whether it's employment, healthcare, housing, everything. And right now, we have a lack of protections for not just LGBTQ people who are students, but also teachers and other administrators. We need to have protections across the board. And another thing to note on this is that we are currently having students do a lot of labor in terms of advancing rights. So for example, before Amy Stevens' case got to the Supreme Court, Gavin Crim's case was in the Supreme Court. Gavin Crim was just a high school kid trying to be a high school kid and trying to use the bathroom that aligned with his gender identity. So we've got a lot of different areas in which states can and should be stepping in to make this sort of thing, in absence of federal legislation, we need states to step up and protect its citizenry and make sure that we are all able to live with dignity and respect.
Yeah, that's really interesting and really important. I want to turn it over now to our middle person on the panel, Connor Corey, who works at one of my favorite organizations, the Whitman Walker Health Organization, doing legal work. And I know that your legal work involves a lot of trans clients and immigration issues and so forth. And so really sort of from on the ground in DC, what are the legal issues that come before you? What does it look like from that perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about, at Whitman Walker, we see a whole host of different legal issues that come in the door that are impacting transgender folks and LGBT folks across the board, particularly low-income folks or people who are facing multiple barriers. And so we see it manifest in discrimination, either just basic public accommodations, like trying to use the restroom in a public facility, employment discrimination. We also see, people who are facing denials of healthcare insurance for trans-affirming care. We have a robust immigration practice. I think it's Mara Kiesling at NCTE that has encouraged us as a community to sort of start really viewing, or maybe not, hopefully it's not starting, hopefully this is something we've been doing, but immigrant rights are trans rights. These are not sort of separate issues. Also, racial justice work is also part and parcel of LGBTQ work. So the immigration practice at Whitman Walker is really becoming more and more robust. And without going too much into all of the different sort of practice areas we have, because the idea is to be a one-stop shop to the extent possible, where somebody can walk in the door and say, I'm lacking access to a work authorization document, I'm undocumented, I'm also, I tried to apply to this job and it was pretty clear to me that they didn't hire me because of something about me. I also don't have health insurance, a whole host of different issues you can imagine. So we try to the extent possible to be an avenue for people to plug in and access different resources. But as I was thinking about this question, one overarching theme that I think is sort of the principal issue that we're seeing over and over again is, and I think my co-panelists have been touching on this actually, just a really deep and profound distrust between community members and the state actors that are charged with presumably protecting us. So that's certainly federal agencies, like any agency involved with immigration by and large. While there are some sub-agencies that at least in theory are intended to be amicable or not hostile towards immigrant communities, nobody trusts these agencies, and oftentimes with good reason. But then even on local levels, so people, even in DC where the mayor is doing some work to at least sort of vociferously say that this is a sanctuary city and there's certain efforts happening, people still don't trust local police. We continue to be an over-policed community, and particularly for trans folks of color. And because of that distrust, there's a huge cascading effect from that, of different legal issues that bubble up because we are not able to rely as a community on state agencies and actors in the same way we should be able to. Some concrete examples are, somebody might, and Sandy knows this from the work that he did on creating the 2015 survey, as a community, by and large, trans people are way more susceptible to hate crimes and to violence in general. And so we know that this is happening. We see clients who are victims of hate crimes all the time. I would say in my experience, and again, I work mostly with immigrant clients, over 95% of the time, people don't want to report the crimes that have occurred to them. A whole host of different reasons why not. One, when they call the police, they suspect, and they're probably right, that when the police arrive, they will be viewed as not as the victim or the survivor, but as a potential suspect. Two, if they're undocumented, they don't trust that local police aren't going to somehow get them involved in immigration enforcement. So we see, and then we see that also cascading into immigration issues. So that person who's a victim of a hate crime may very well have an avenue to immigration relief by virtue of having been the victim of a crime in the United States. But in order to do that, you have to cooperate with police or with prosecutors. Again, something that most clients are extremely reticent to do. Another issue I'd say is, in terms of this distrust, is the administration currently obviously is doing a lot to actually, Mark mentioned a specific policy around adoption with same-sex families, but they're also just doing a lot of fear-mongering just to kind of like get people afraid as possible to, whether it's access benefits, apply for asylum, do anything to sort of come out of the shadows and try to advance themselves. So recently you may have heard in the news all this chatter around a public charge ground of inadmissibility, and this administration's attempt to expand, so this is a rule that immigration will use to consider whether somebody can become a lawful permanent resident based on if their likelihood in the future to become reliant on the state for basic self-sustenance. So if somebody in the past has received cash benefits, that's going to damage their ability to potentially become a lawful permanent resident. Whole host of people that are just flat out not subject to this rule. And this administration has now put out sort of policies to try to expand what they can consider in determining whether somebody is going to become a public charge. It's enjoined, at least on sort of the stateside work, but it has been highly effective in having a dramatic chilling effect on people's, despite, I mean, truly, at least 90% of my clients are just flat out not impacted by this rule. They're just not impacted because there's statutory carve-outs that asylees, for example, when they go to adjust status to apply for their green card, they don't have to worry about this public charge nonsense. They're just exempt from it. But my clients still, they don't want to enroll in public benefits, even though they need access to HIV meds, they need trans-affirming care, they need basic preventative care, but they're not signing up for it because this administration has been so effective at instilling fear in people. And so there's a ton of work to be done on trying to counter some of those fear tactics.
Wow, that's really interesting. I want to jump back to Sandy. You referenced, Connor, that Sandy, before he took his current job, was the head, the brains behind the biggest survey of transgender Americans ever done. This is probably because in addition to his JD, he has a PhD, also from Georgetown. So you win the prize for most highly educated. But based on your experience in running that survey, I mean, I'm sure there, practically every issue that impacts marginalized communities impacts the trans community, and we've just heard immigration specifically. Are there any others that you would call out as kind of key or essential or fundamental?
Yeah, all of them.
All of them.
So, all of the things that I touched on before and things that other people have touched on up here, healthcare access. Now, for those people who don't know, transgender people are people. So sometimes you just need routine health care, and that is something that a lot of trans people don't actually have access to. So we hear a lot about transition-related care. It's going to cost this, it's going to bring the military down, it's going to do whatever, but sometimes you just actually have a cold and you need to go, and you can't even get health care access for that. That's a problem. So my main goal of my narrative here is going to be to just emphasize that transgender people are people. The word people is very important in that, because I think what has been so successful with this vilification of trans people is making them seem like they're not actual, real human beings that have the same needs. I'll get to the bathroom issue in just 1 second, because I always take the bathroom issue last. Because before we get to the bathroom issue, we have to talk about all the other areas. So, like I said before, employment. Being able to actually be employed and to keep that job. Amy Stevens is a great example of that. Right. She was a great employee before, all of a sudden she's not, just because somebody doesn't like her. Not getting into the Title VII arguments, very interesting overall, great legal debate, but at the end of the day, somebody doesn't like her because she's a transgender person. They decided it was okay to fire her. We can't have society in 2019 where that's okay, no matter what the courts are saying. Also, one thing that impacts trans people a lot is access to identification documents. Now, everywhere we go, particularly in DC, you're always having to show someone an ID to get around. What if your ID doesn't actually match your presentation? What if there's some kind of a disparity or incongruity in your IDs? You've got one gender marker versus a different name. It causes a lot of confusion. Not only does it cause confusion, but it actually puts trans people in harm's way. It leads to violence, it leads to all sorts of things. So I mentioned education before, where somebody should have access to the facilities that that align with their gender identity. That's often an issue that, it's a privacy issue for other people, but how about we're just trying to use the restroom? I always ask people when I go and talk about restrooms, have any of you gone through a day without using a restroom? Anybody in here managed to get through a whole day of work, of school, anything, without using a bathroom? No. And I would submit to you that trans people are trying to use the bathroom. And public bathrooms are disgusting. Nobody likes using public restrooms, right? They're not a fun place. We all have to use them because we are all human beings who have to do that. And if you cannot use the bathroom, you cannot work. If you cannot use the bathroom, you can't go to school. We have a case at Free State recently where a kid was soiling himself because he was avoiding using the bathroom because he was not allowed to use the bathroom. And all of these measures that people are coming up with to accommodate trans people, like, oh, well, you can use that one bathroom over there that's reserved for the nurse that's 5 miles from any of your classrooms, but by the way, you will get written up if you're tardy at the gym once you go over there. That's a separate but equal standard. We've seen this before. And I would say we've seen all of these things before. This is not new. It's just a new category of person in there. We can look back to the civil rights movement. We can look back to all kinds of things. Trans people are the people who are in the crosshairs right now. Once we resolve this thing for trans people, it will be some other group. Until we get to the point where we say it is unacceptable to discriminate against people. And to that point, I wanted to bring up, as I was listening to the Title VII arguments, there was a lot of talk about bathrooms, which really brings up, the most important point maybe that I might make here, is there is a lack of understanding of who trans people are. We need to be better in educating people so that people are seeing trans people as, not demonizing them and seeing them as some nefarious person who's trying to commit some crime in a bathroom. They're just trying to use the restroom. And until we get to the point where the narrative is that trans people are people who just want to work, go to school, and do everything that everybody gets to do, we are not going to be able to get past these issues. And the one part that stuck with me from those arguments, there were lots of interesting back and forth, but it was when Justice Sotomayor said, at what point does invidious discrimination become a thing that we're not allowing, essentially? I'm distilling it a little bit, right? But that to me is a key takeaway, and so I've listed a whole bunch of things that are affecting trans people, but the key takeaway is we need to be more educated about who trans people are. We need to be seen as human beings, just like everyone else.
Yeah. So it went very close to the end, maybe the very end of the argument. In the second case, there were two cases before the court. One involved sexual orientation, one involved gender identity. And the legal issue in both cases was, what is the scope of the phrase discrimination because of sex, meaning discrimination because of an individual's sex, that is in Title VII, along with the other prohibited classifications for discrimination. And the first case, as I said, involved sexual orientation. The second involved gender identity. And even though in the first case there was no reference to gender identity, there was no issue in the gender identity case about use of bathrooms. That was not what happened. What happened is that an individual who worked in a funeral home worked there for 6 years as a male, and then announced that she was transitioning. She wanted to continue working, same job, same person, as a woman, and she was fired. So some of us think that sounds a lot like discrimination based on her sex, right? What changed? The only thing that changed was that the employee who was known as a man was then known as a woman. So despite the fact that bathrooms were nowhere in the picture, it is true that a number of the justices asked these bathroom questions, and it was very disturbing. I mean, it was very frustrating, it was very othering, it was like, is there no empathy among these 9 people? And I don't literally mean that, actually, because I trust that there is. But at the very end of the argument, Justice Sotomayor, who had been the first justice to pose a question related to bathrooms, and who kept pressing it, and I think some people were confused by that. My take on why she was pressing it was not that she herself necessarily, I mean, I don't know this to be a fact, but it's my speculation, that not that she herself was bothered by this issue, but that she knew that other members of the court were bothered. And one of the things you learn to do as a lawyer when you watch a Supreme Court argument is that you realize that the justices are talking to each other in asking their questions, probably at least as much as they're talking to the lawyers who are up there trying to argue. So I think she was pressing to get a sort of clear, concise answer. But at the very end, she said, at what point, I mean, we know all this invidious discrimination is going on. We know that people in these two communities, if you will, are being harmed every day by specifically workplace discrimination, which is what Title VII covers. At what point, should we not as a court say, yes, this is covered? We could interpret the meaning of sex discrimination either way. There's an argument this way, an argument that way. Which way are we going to jump, basically? Are we going to jump in favor of protecting human rights and allowing people who do well at their job to continue doing their job? And I thought it was a dramatic moment also. But I know that I think that Paul and Mark and I, and maybe others as well, have sort of different predictions about what might come out of the court. So I want to take about 5 minutes and just open it up to predictions. I left the argument thinking that there was a better chance of winning the argument that gender identity falls within the scope of sex discrimination than winning the argument that sexual orientation does. And I could go on about why, but I won't. Mark, you disagree.
Yeah, I do, which is surprising to me because I expected the same thing, in part because courts actually started interpreting sex discrimination to encompass anti-trans discrimination much earlier.
20 years ago.
Yeah, before they started looking at it as a sexual orientation issue as well. So it seemed to me like the easy route for the court would be to say, well, of course, if someone presents as a man one day and then says, I'm now presenting as a woman and gets fired for it, of course that's sex discrimination. As you said, what's changed is sex. And then said, oh, but for sexual orientation, you're really talking about attraction to other people. It's this sort of, it's a different trait. But what I think I saw, and we can debate this, was a few conservative justices, particularly Justice Neil Gorsuch, who presents himself as a textualist, latch on to the textualist argument in the sexual orientation context and not the gender identity context. By which I mean, there's this theory of statutory interpretation that says you look at the words. You don't look at what Congress intended. You don't look at the purpose or the history. You look at the words. And what Justice Gorsuch said, which I think is correct, is the statute only says there has to be some kind of discrimination because of sex, and sex only has to be one of a potential number of factors. So if a company has two employees, say a man and a woman, the man gets married and puts out a picture of his husband and gets fired. The woman gets married and puts out a picture of her husband and gets promoted. What's the difference there? What's the factor that caused the man to get fired and let the woman keep her job? And the answer, of course, is sex. If a white employee marries a black person and gets fired for it, that's race discrimination. If a male employee marries another man and gets fired for it, that should be sex discrimination. And that's the argument that I thought I saw Gorsuch latch onto. And I think that he started to sort of create this idea of sex meaning biological sex, by which I would describe sort of sex assigned at birth. And I think that he started to, in the trans the context, drift away from the rights framing of these issues and start viewing trans people and transitioning and gender identity as something different from biological sex, and therefore something that fell outside the scope of Title VII. So if I had to place bets, I would think that we win sexual orientation and lose gender identity. So, what do you think, Paul?
I think they're going to go one way or the other with both of them, frankly.
Great. We can all shake hands. So one of the three of us will win.
We've got all the bases covered. Going in, I agreed with Mark that the transgender case we were more likely to win because there is this sense that people instinctively understand that when you fire somebody for coming in as a different gender the next day, that has something to do with gender or sex. And it's almost impossible to articulate what you're doing without talking about sex. And there have been very conservative judges around the country who have understood that and figured this is just obvious. In many ways, the most powerful argument for why transgender discrimination is discrimination because of sex is the argument by analogy to religion. If somebody says I love hiring Jews, I love hiring Christians, I don't discriminate either way, but if somebody switches from one to the other, they're out, then that conversion firing is obviously because of religion. And so this seems like a very easy argument, whereas I think a lot of people resist the sexual orientation argument, the very one that Mark made about the two people with the picture of their husband, one's man, one's woman, or the idea that there's something about not living up to sexual stereotypes that is inherent in firing somebody because of same-sex attraction. People resist that because they think you can differentiate between sex on the one hand and sexual orientation. And that an employer who fires both gay men and lesbians is not discriminating on the basis of sex, discriminating on the basis of same-sex attraction or something else, sexual orientation. And that may very well be what the court ends up holding. But I agree with Mark that Justice Gorsuch, to the extent that he was at least sort of playing around with the possibility of a textualist answer, seemed at least as strong on the sexual orientation case. He did, at the same time, make all these comments about how maybe this is really too hard, it's too legislative, we should wait for Congress. What about religious exemptions? Every time anybody drafts a statute, there's a religious exemption. We don't have one here because you're reading it into an existing statute. And it was 1964, nobody really thought this. So, you know, it's hard to get too optimistic about this, but because of this very strong textual arguments, this may be the one case in which we could get over the line with a fifth vote, or maybe if you get 5, maybe you get more than 5. These were cases that everybody was rushing to get to the court back when Justice Kennedy was there, and suddenly everyone was rushing to try to get them back when Justice Kennedy was gone. Right. But it might be just one of the crooks of history that somebody like Justice Gorsuch might say, look, I want to show the people of this country that I'm not just a right-wing guy who just votes right-wing and everything. I really take seriously my methodology, and if he does that, he may very well say, Congress could change this if they disagree with me, but I'm going to just sort of follow what I think the words say and prove to people that, I may have been nominated by that guy in 1600, but I'm a real judge.
Was that the year or the address?
I'm a real judge who is trying to follow the text. So we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see.
We'll see. So I want to ask the three of you if you have if you want to jump in on this, and I'd broaden it a little bit, although you're all lawyers, to ask about something that Sandy alluded to, and that is sort of communications. How to talk about some of these issues. If your chance, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, Sandy just demonstrated what we tell people to do, and what's effective is, we're talking about people and really talking about when we say discrimination, what does that mean? And discrimination kills. We have horrifyingly high rates of violence and killings of trans women of color. We also have high rates of people dying from lack of medical access and care because of the discrimination they face. So CAP found that LGBT people who face discrimination are 7 times less likely to go to the doctor. And if you're not going to the doctor, you're not catching, any variety of ailments that people might have, and you're not getting the preventative care that you need, and we're seeing this impact. Poverty also kills. Williams Institute just came out with an amazing study, and it was really horrifying. 1/3 of bisexual women and transgender people live below the poverty line. CAP found that LGBT people are more likely to need public benefits because of living in poverty. And if you're not able to access the things that you need to survive because you go to a shelter or something and you're turned away because you're trans and the provider says we don't serve your kind, that impacts your safety. It impacts your ability to live. So I think we're focusing really on articulating when we say discrimination, what is it we're talking about? What are the lived experiences of people? Because we're talking about people. And that's been really impactful. So talking about bathrooms, not a single one of these bathroom bills is law right now. The closest we got was HB 2 in North Carolina, and that got pulled back. And our opponents have shifted their strategy because it was a losing argument. So with the Equality Act fight, bathrooms did not come up. We were all ready for bathrooms. We were all ready for religious exemptions. Our opponents landed on, we will destroy women's sports if we pass this bill.
The latest one, yeah.
That's where they're at. It's sports. And I was honestly shocked to see Louis Gohmert suddenly a huge advocate for women's equity in sports, because this is a man that voted against equal pay for women. But now he's suddenly a feminist when it comes to making sure that women athletes are able to compete equally. So that's where we're at now is, and again, it is this storytelling, and it's saying like who trans people are and what people's lives are. And it's not that you have these super performing ringers that are trying to get a bunch of scholarships in sports. Like, I mean, you know, that's not the case. Most people are just pretty average when it comes to, like, I mean, these two are laughing because it's like, you know, it's not like being a trans man has suddenly given you this incredible sports prowess and like you guys are winning all these tournaments. No. And so it is really just telling stories and explaining who people are and humanizing the issue is what's been really effective.
Yeah, I think we've seen some problems with sports scholarships recently at colleges, but I don't recall that any of them included trans students. More like, you know, children of actors or something. Maybe ought to be where the focus is. Well, I wanted to take a few minutes and see if there are any questions from the audience for any of our panel members.
Is there anyone on the panel a log cabin Republican?
Why do you ask that?
I just
The question
I use
is
the words. I use the words to ask the question is all. I don't make a reason.
Okay, I don't. I'm not, and you know, if anybody else wants to respond, they can. The question was: is anyone on the panel a log cabin Republican?
Crickets, I think. I mean, I think the log cabin Republicans are a very interesting group because, of course, they've endorsed Donald Trump for 2020, and I think that's an interesting tack, given that Donald Trump has worked very hard to undermine rights that log cabin Republicans, who are the gay Republican group, presumably wish to exercise. I think log cabin Republicans are a nice illustration that at least in 2019 America, we divide more along partisan lines than anything else. Partisanship can transcend a whole lot. And if you feel a deep attachment to the party and to Donald Trump, then it may not matter if Trump is working against your rights. You may feel like, you know, he's the guy for you. But if you look at the polling, most LGBTQ people do not support Republicans. And I think the reason has been made pretty clear by this administration.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Was there an amicus brief submitted to inform the justices, and was there serious consideration by the justices that the supposed threats of the bathroom issue really are non-existent, that the privacy invasions that are being discussed, and especially that the potential like assaults that are being discussed really are not happening? So, you know, did any justice suggest that the discussion of this is really disproportionate to any sort of threats that are out there?
Well, there were dozens of amicus briefs submitted, and I have not read them all. I imagine that at least some of them dealt with that issue and sought to rebut it. But, you know, personally, I'll speak personally, I don't think it was about whether there was anything in the amicus briefs, or the parties' briefs for that matter, which they did read. I think it's coming from the same sort of impulse that I attributed, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, to Justice Sotomayor, which I think is fundamentally a political, you know, sort of set of questions and concerns that, you know, that the conservative politically conservative justices, or at least some of them, have. So I think it's tough to, tough to imagine that even the best written brief by anybody is going to be able to allay fears that have become so essential to a certain political viewpoint. Do you want to say?
Yeah, but I do think in part what you saw with all of those questions was the court likes to know exactly the scope of what they're deciding and what it means to say that transgender discrimination is covered by Title VII. They were just thinking out loud about, well, what is the next case, and how broad a ruling will this be, and what kind of problems might we run into. But it also has, as Dan said, a very political dimension, because the court's going to be a lot more comfortable deciding in favor of the plaintiffs if they think that the American people are going to embrace that decision. That's just the nature of the court. And if they think they're going to stir up a hornet's nest of people fearful that their daughters are going to be attacked in restrooms or something like that, that's going to hold them back. And so, I mean, I didn't find it as surprising as some people that they did. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it is sort of the things that are actually on their mind.
Well, I mean, I would, sort of change. I mean, I didn't read all of the briefs on either of the sides, but I read the parties' briefs and the brief of the United States, and the administration supported the employer in this case, and those briefs, and I imagined additional briefs on that side, raised the bathroom and sports issue and the locker room issue and so much, a great deal.
Yeah. I wish that the justices had all met at least one trans person, and I don't think that they all have, and I think that that's a huge part of the problem in these cases too. Like by the time Obergefell came to the court, and even when Lawrence came to the court, all of the justices had certainly met openly gay people. Some of them had had openly gay clerks. There was this whole thing about how Justice O'Connor had sent a present to one of her former clerks who was a lesbian who had just given birth. And even Justice Thomas had a picture of one of his former clerks in their part, whatever. They all know gay people. They've seen Will and Grace, whatever. I don't know that all of the justices have met or know that they have met an openly transgender person. And so they are fearful in some ways, or they are ignorant in some ways.
It's true. I mean, and having worked for a while on the North Carolina Amendment 2 thing, if you actually put in front of a real judge, even a conservative Republican judge, a transgender person, a real person, and say, this is a person who needs to go to the bathroom, where would you like this person going to the bathroom? The answer is obvious. And it's the place they've been going until this court session. Where do you think they've been going? Women go in the women's room, men go in the men's room. And if they don't, they have a lot of trouble. And so, I mean, I think these things can be handled effectively. And it may very well be true that just a little bit of percolating of that issue, it's lost all its potency. People have sort of gotten over it. Yeah. As you say, we've moved on to trying to save the women's lacrosse team or something.
It is a remarkable phenomenon how many conservative Republican appointees have ruled in favor of transgender school children in cases where I bet they were not going into this case thinking this is how I'm going to rule, but the kid sits in their courtroom and they see them and they learn who they are and they realize this is crazy. It would be crazy to force this person to not use the correct bathroom.
Well, and along that lines, a moment that I thought was really tremendous in the argument was when David Cole, who's an old friend and a former colleague from many lives, actually, said, in framing one of his responses to a question, he was arguing in favor of Amy Stevens, the plaintiff in the funeral home case, referenced that there are trans lawyers here, in this courtroom. I mean, there's at least there are trans lawyers' names on the brief filed by the ACLU, and there were trans lawyers and trans people in the courtroom, and I felt like what he was trying to get the justices to do. What he was saying, in effect, was, look these people in the eye and tell them there's something wrong with continuing to work at that job. And I don't know if any of them took it that way. I don't know if it had that impact on anybody else at the argument. But I thought that was, I've never heard a lawyer say, basically, these people are here in this courtroom. In speaking about a group that probably the justices are ignorant about and fearful of.
Just to add something to that, because I am a government person, like a political science type person, we don't have as much information about political attitudes and behaviors, right? So attitudes towards trans people, there are some groups that are collecting this information. It is incredibly important to know general attitudes are. If you look at a cross-section of people and you say, hey, do you know any trans people? And they're like, oh yeah, I'm fine with trans people. And then you ask them, would you be okay with a trans person who is a family member? All of a sudden those numbers go down, right? So everybody's like, trans people are great, let's have equal rights for trans people. Maybe not so comfortable with a trans person being in my family. And then you start to ask other little things to chip away at what's going on. And a big thing that comes up is an inherent distrust of trans people. And you see it in arguments or defenses that are allowed to stand, such as trans panic defense, which really speaks to that inherent mistrust of trans people. They're doing something. And so in that, we've talked about violence a lot, so sometimes when acts of violence are committed, heinous acts of violence are committed against trans people, the perpetrator is allowed to mount the defense that this person was trans, it freaked me out, so I just had to kill them. That is essentially trans panic defense. Gay panic defense works the same way. I couldn't believe it. I was shocked. Can you believe they were trans? That's why I killed them. Wouldn't you all kill that person? Right, so these kind of defenses are only allowed to stand because of this inherent mistrust of trans people. The trans people are doing something. There's something shady about it, dishonest. And if you got to know a trans person, it'll be a lot harder for you to be like, oh, I see that you're doing something. Oh, I see it. You are shifty. Those things can only be propped up as long as trans people are something we talk about over there and we don't have a knowledge of who they are. Contact theory is real. We all know that. When you get to know people who are different from you, you understand them, and all of a sudden you can't vilify them in the same way. So yeah, that kid in the courtroom who clearly needs to just go to the bathroom, you're like, of course, let him go to the bathroom. Let's stop this. And I think the same thing needs to happen in the conversation. We need to understand where public attitudes currently are and the kinds of narratives that will help to shift those attitudes towards something else, where trans people are seen as just, again, people.
One thing I'll add, if you don't mind, really quickly, is we're talking a lot about like external sort of communications, and one thing I'm always concerned about, given our history as a community, is sort of how we internally talk to each other, both in terms of creating litigation strategies, as well as then how we ultimately bring it to the public. And one thing that I feel like we have to be really careful about in all this, well, first of all, depending on how this case comes out, it could potentially be very divisive for our community, and we'll have to think through how we respond if it comes out one way or the other. Sexual orientation is covered, but gender identity is not. Are we going to regress back to years ago when we were saying to trans people, just hold on and wait? But then the other thing I'm concerned about with trans rights in particular is if we say to a judge, look at this kid, isn't he clearly a boy? Why wouldn't you let him use the boys' restroom? That's a really dangerous legal argument in my perspective, because Sandy hopefully can correct me on this statistic, but I think your survey in 2015 showed that the quickest growing segment of our trans community is people who identify as gender queer, gender non-binary. And so we have to be really careful about saying, this is clearly a woman, and therefore she should use a bathroom, or this is clearly a man, because it also gives so much power to whoever this adjudicator is of like, does this person meet your definition of what a man should look like? And so just in terms of that sort of internal facing litigation strategy, that's something I feel like are conversations we have to be having.
Naomi?
So I thank you so much for raising that, Connor, because what I wanted to raise for the panel was the whole conversation had been in some ways about binaries still. And you guys had talked about L and G and T, but not so much about B and Q. And I think both the arguments about sexual orientation and gender identity really raise these other questions about not just discrimination among straight people about bisexuals, but some skepticism and discrimination within the gay community as well. And I think and then Connor essentially made the point that I wanted to make about non-binary, gender, queer folks. And so aren't those in some ways the category of people who, when it's easy to decide by the picture you put up on Facebook or how obvious it is about which bathroom you should use, aren't those the folks that sort of get left out and become the targets of mistrust and fear and discrimination?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and certainly the issues that are not even the next wave of issues, but the sort of current wave of issues, I think very much is about people who don't fit into this binary one way or the other, in various, by various modes. And that's, I mean, it really goes back to the civil rights paradigm, right? Because what you have as a mechanism is discrimination based on X. And, I mean, maybe we can queer Title VII enough so that sex means non-binary as well as binary and so on and so forth. I don't know. But I do think that those are very important issues.
Right. Yeah, things have moved very, very quickly from the issue of Gavin Grimm going to the bathroom to people saying, why should I have to make a choice? Why do you have them all divided up in this rigid way? Why don't we just all sort of have places for everybody? And that is, I think, in some ways, a beacon of the future, which could help solve some of this problem.
Yeah, no, right. I think you have to, the law is so twisted up with gender. And so you've got sports, you've got bathrooms, you've got this, you've got that. You've got passports, identification documents. You need to untwist, sort of unwind that and bring the approach that's the most liberatory that can work in that context. Passports are different from bathrooms, right? And there are reasons in each situation why the sort of hyper binary, isn't necessary, doesn't make sense, whatever. But I think it's going to take a while for the state, the law, to really address those. So, and there was someone in the back. Yes, go ahead.
I have it. Thank you. Yes, a couple thoughts. One is, I come from California, very proudly to say we've had laws against discrimination in LGBTQ for a long time. And I've always been really concerned about all those other states that don't, in regard, especially my focus was in regard to work, and that you can be fired just because somebody doesn't like the fact you're gay or transgender or whatever. So, we had Obama's administration, and we did not have a change in regard to including that protection. So I'm curious where you see we're at this far down. Hopefully Trump doesn't get reelected and we have a Democratic president and Congress. The possibility of getting that change was my first question. And then I so agree with when you said that judges not knowing somebody who's trans, and when you know somebody, it just changes the whole picture. What's the possibility with Supreme Court justices as far as, this probably sounds naive, introducing them, even if it's within the court, that you have some people with you and you're making an argument and I don't know if they're ever allowed to speak. So if you could just address those two questions, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I just want to do one quick clarification, which is that the EEOC interpreted Title VII during the Obama administration to include sexual orientation and gender identity, as did a number of federal courts. So it's
federal agencies.
And other agencies. So those court decisions that we won is why we have these cases at the Supreme Court. So this is the first and definitive ruling from the Supreme Court.
Also with workplace, Obama's executive order on contractors was the largest expansion in workplace non-discrimination protections for LGBT people we've seen. 1 in 5 workers works for a federal contractor, and the EO prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, even if you're not on a federal contract, if you work for a company that has a contract. So 1 in 5 workers in the country were protected under that.
But both of these are now at risk, basically. And so what Sharita said earlier about the Equality Act pending in Congress would specify certain things in federal law. And so that's, that's just a quick response to that. I don't know in terms of, I think it's a great idea to sort of, have some way to expand the knowledge base of our current justices.
Justice Scalia did meet Laverne Cox at a
Wait,
White House
what?
Correspondents' Dinner. Yes, there is a picture of
Oh,
them
that's
together.
right. I remember that. I remember that.
You know, I don't think he would have voted the right way in these cases. He did right on Cauley, though. But yeah, you know, there's no formal mechanism by which you can sort of force the Supreme Court justices to hobnob with a trans person. This has to happen a little bit more organically, and there's actually never been an openly transgender law clerk at the Supreme Court. There has been at the Canada Supreme Court, actually, and she reached out to me, and we did a little bit of research, and there's been no openly trans clerk on either the U.S. Supreme Court or any state Supreme Court. So there's, you know, these things happen to have to happen organically, but there are ways to kind of speed them along. And so hopefully with the, you know, the influx of LGBTQ people in the law and openly trans people in the law, the justices will have more face time with people who are not like
So what about the other half of the question? Do the Democrats take the Senate by one vote? Do they pass the Equality Act?
I mean, we get rid of the filibuster.
Well, I think assume
This is not
assume the
this is
filibuster is gone.
a process thing, not a advocating thing. Yeah, why not?
I mean, right after HR 1, right?
Yeah, we have the whole package. Just and there's all these bills just waiting on a Senate change to have all these reforms and restorations of democracy. So
Yep.
that's part of the
Persist.
package.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, I'm sorry, you're, okay, all right, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it should be brief. You all started to touch on this, but in terms of the parallels between Title VII and Title IX, would adverse outcomes in these cases foreclose the possibility of Obama-style interpretations by a future progressive Department of Education under Title IX?
Oh, from the advocate side, I'm looking at the lawyers. I'm saying, don't say the thing I know you're going to say.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't
Depends a little what they
foreclose.
say, I suppose.
Yeah, it doesn't foreclose, and it does depend on what they say. It could make it quite difficult, quite difficult. I'm going to we're out of time. We're out of time. But I want you to join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion. And I'm sure all of us would be happy to continue the conversation afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you.